Okay. Dear colleagues, we'll put it here. I'm happy to invite our guest, Dr. Artur Ribeiro from the University of Kiel. Dr. Artur Ribeiro is a research fellow. He finished his PhD at the University of Kiel, master at the University College of London, and is dealing extensively in the field of archaeological theory and philosophy in archaeological research. And he will give us a lecture, The Sense of an Ending, Understanding Time in Archaeology. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just set my timer here. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I need to thank Jakob for the invitation. I'd like to thank the Czech Academy of Science, for the very warm welcome. And so yeah, I'll be talking about understanding time in archaeology. So just a question. I know Jakob knows this because I just told him a little bit. Does anyone know where this title comes from? Anyone ever heard this title before? So this is, just to get a general idea, this is a novel by Julian Barnes from around early 2000s, won the Booker Prize, really good book. And we're going to talk about endings in a little bit, that's why I really like the title. I like the novel. So let's just get into it, and I'll give you a bit more context as we go along, because this is going to be a strange talk. It's a theory talk, and even among theorists, this would be very weird for them. They would think this is not how you usually do things. But I hope it helps you. I hope you get some new ideas. I hope it's a bit original. So, wait. Is it this one? No. Okay. Yes, thank you. No problem. And so this is, especially for students, I like to show them how long everything is going to be so they don't get stressed out and get too bored. So it'll be 60 slides, about 60 minutes, maybe a bit shorter. But yeah, so this is going to be what we're going to go through. And so let's start talking a little bit about time in archaeology, especially when it comes to theory. So the person that's written most about time in archaeology, at least theoretically, has been Gavin Lucas. He has a book from around 2005. He's got an updated version making time from 2021, so fairly recent. And, he talks about metaphysics of time, differences between past, present, and future. He also has this other perspective, which is the before and after, back in the day in physics, in the early 1900s, in 1908, McTaggart wrote a paper that differentiated different types of time. And Gavin Lucas, he talks about different types of time, and he says which one is better for archaeology, which one is not. So that's really what he's been working on, all these years. But that's not the only way talking about time. There's also Big History of Human Lives, which was a very important book that talked about temporalities. And for those who don't know about temporalities is, when we talk about, the duration of the people's lives in the past, right? Because sometimes and I'll give a very specific example. They'll say during these 300 years, this group of people invaded, another group, or whatever. But when you think about it, that's a really long time of invasion. I mean, it doesn't happen like that. It's not 300 years of people let's go, invade. No, there's smaller phases, there's things happening, there's ups and downs. So temporalities is this idea that, at a human scale, things happen in a different way, there's rhythms, etc. So those are usually, when you look at the literature about time in archaeology, that's usually the two ways you hear about it. There's a lot more. There's a lot of smaller papers that address time in different ways. I can't talk about all of them, but temporalities and the work of Gavin Lucas, usually the two ways. And I think we're missing something. So I've been trying to, in recent times, I've been trying to build up a new idea and try to understand time differently. And I think we're living in a very interesting time because we're seeing the collapse of time in different ways in recent years, in recent decades. And we're seeing the collapse of endings. And I'll explain what I mean by this. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about geopolitics and economics. So sorry for the wall of text. It's a lot of words. But one of the things I've been studying recently has been, post-modernity or late modernity and late capitalism and all of that. So just as an introduction, we are living in a period that's been called late capitalism from an economic standpoint, postmodernism from a cultural standpoint, supermodernity, that's what Marc Augier calls it, empire, neo-capitalism, super capitalism, 24/7 capitalism, and blah, blah, blah. And there are countless more. And it's a period that started after World War II with processes of decolonization and the restructuring of the global political and economic order, according to a three-world system at the beginning, then a two-world system from the 80s onwards, based on the Brandt line. This is what separates what they call the global north from the global south, and now a one world or flat world system. There has been a veritable act of flattening the world through the global economy. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this transition over the 20th century from classic capitalism to late capitalism, or from modernity to postmodernity, is neither linear nor immediate, nor does it manifest the same intensity across the globe. There are still elements of classic capitalism and modernity in the world today, which is what many archaeologists still critique, and there's a lot of books about that. So that's, in very general terms, what has been happening, in the 20th century and now also in the 21st century. A little bit about late capitalism. Late capitalism, it was studied, the name comes from the work of Werner Sombart from the early 1920s, 1915s, 1920s. And he talked about something called spit capitalisms. And late capitalism, the person that really understood it well was the Belgian Marxist thinker Ernest Mandel. And he wrote a book in 75 called Late Capitalism, where he explained things really well. Despite the name, late capitalism does not necessarily indicate its final nor its imminent collapse. Much on the contrary, according to Mandel, late capitalism reveals a stronger global form of capitalism, one that is more distilled and pure. Late capitalism is not the spread of capitalist mode of production around the world, but rather the establishment of a global network of exchange, which includes pre-capitalist modes of production. At the beginning, late capitalism required underdeveloped regions of the world, since it is in these regions that basic goods, raw materials, and cheap labor can be obtained. At the time of writing, late capitalism operated according to a three-world system or two-world system, but in the meanwhile, it has transitioned into a more complex, deterritorialized one-world or flat world system built upon incredibly complex networks. So this is just a very brief introduction to what has been happening in the 20th century, the transition from, I call it classic capitalism, but that's not the correct term, but an older version of capitalism to late capitalism, and from modernity to postmodernity or late modernity or whatever some people call it, liquid modernity or whatever. So there's two modernities that appear in the 20th century. And we're technically in the second one. We're in the late modernity or post-modernity. So that's just the context. Something also very important is during the 20th century, let's grab some water. During the 20th century, especially towards the end, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. We had the collapse of all the communist projects. And this was, 89. We had, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and eventually a couple of years later, the Iron Curtain falls. Now, here's why this is important. Will become, noticeable later on when I talk about it. As this was happening, Francis Fukuyama wrote the book, The End of History and the Last Man. So what was happening as Soviet Union was crumbling apart? Fukuyama said, okay, we've reached the end of history, because according to Marx, communism should have been the end of history. That should have been the final phase, but that didn't happen. So what Fukuyama argued was that the end of history is actually neoliberal democracy. That's the final phase of history, and we're not going to find anything better. He said that, yeah, things can go back and forth, but neoliberal democracy is really the end state. There's nothing really much better than it. So we're going to keep going back to it constantly, and that's the end of history. So this was written in, 92. So just right after, the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is interesting, and we'll see why. So Frederick Jameson, he says that now we've entered a phase. We've entered a phase where, in the postmodern phase, where it's really difficult to think historically in the first place. Because now with the end of history, we've reached this point where that's it. We're not going to move forward anymore, right? And this is a point that he made in the book. And some years later, in the 2000s, Frederick Jameson again, he says, late capitalism seems to have no natural enemies. Yet it is not only the invisible universality of capitalism which is at issue, tirelessly undoing all the social gains made since the inception of socialist and communist movements, repealing all the welfare measures, the safety net, the right to unionization, industrial ecological regulatory laws, offering to privatize pensions, and indeed to dismantle whatever stands in the way of the free market all over the world. What is crippling is not the presence of an enemy, but rather the universal belief, not only that this tendency is irreversible, but that the historic alternatives to capitalism have been proven unviable and impossible, and that no other socioeconomic system is conceivable, let alone practically available. On the social level, this means that our imaginations are hostages to our own mode of production, and perhaps to whatever remnants of past ones it has preserved. So the book Archaeologies of the Future, what it does something very interesting, where it traces how our way of thinking utopia has changed since the fall of the Soviet Union. Because utopia was very, very much associated to communist thought for a while. But then, with the fall of the Soviet Union, our ways of thinking utopia have changed completely. And this is what he's referring to. When we think of utopia today, it's a very strange version of utopia, because it has to be thought in terms of capitalism, because that's the system we are in right now. So, very interesting book. So, another Mark Fisher book from 2009. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Here's another issue. So, and just to end this part, this is a much older book, so this is way before all the stuff I was talking about. But there's a section in the book that I really like, where he says, unending sameness also governs the relationship to the past. What is new is the phase of mass culture compared to that of late liberalism, is the exclusion of the new. The machine is rotating on the same spots. While it already determines consumption, rejects anything untried as a risk. In film, any manuscript which is not reassuringly based on a bestseller is viewed with mistrust. That is why there's incessant talk of ideas, novelties, surprises, of what is both totally familiar and has never existed before. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the last slide of the section. And so what we have now, and why I chose the title, The Sense of an Ending, is that we're actually losing the capacity to think of endings. Because now we're just in a system, what a lot of authors call the on and on system. It's a system of on and on, but we don't know where it's going. Whereas thinkers in the past, they would say like, okay, we're in this period of history, there's this past, and there's going to be this future. This is what's going to happen in the future. Today, we're in a situation where we don't know what the future is going to be. We don't know what the next phase is going to be. So it's this situation of unendingness, of on and on. Yeah. Initially, I was going to title this section Never Ending Story, because I thought that would be the correct way of talking about this. So that's just one of the ways that has affected our way of thinking about time. And this will then reflect into archaeology. The collapse of meta-narratives, also same thing that was happening at exactly the same time. Adorno. So he stated that no universal history leads from savagery to humanitarianism, but there is one leading from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. So Adorno, he recognizes that technology does advance. However, he's not a big believer in the big meta-narratives. He was a very, very big critic of those long-term meta-narratives that, showed progression, that showed we were going somewhere better. Jean-François Lyotard, this book explicitly critiques meta-narratives. So he says, I will use the term modern to designate any science that legitimates itself with reference to meta-discourse of this kind, making an explicit appeal to some grand narrative, such as the dialectics of the spirit, the hermeneutics of meaning, the emancipation of the rational or working subject, or the creation of wealth. Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narrative. So we've entered now a phase where meta-narratives, long-term narratives, we're not convinced by them anymore. So, but why did this happen? That's the thing. I don't think a lot of people think about this enough. So in the beginning of the Enlightenment, like the early 18th century, I know some people debate when it started exactly. Like the Enlightenment really used the tree metaphor. I was going through doing some research into this, and it was quite surprising how the tree is used, the genealogical tree especially, to explain things like how science developed, how certain religions developed, how science is supposed to operate, how history operates, etc. It's a genealogical model. In the 19th century, in addition to the tree metaphor, you get the meta-narrative. You get the long-term history, and that starts playing a very important role. And we're going to see that in a couple of slides. However, both the meta-narrative and the genealogical tree, the tree metaphor, they disappear after World War II. They lose credibility in favor of the network. The network is what becomes really important after World War II. In particular, the rhizome becomes one of the favorite metaphors that illustrate how reality actually works, including time. So for those who don't know, the rhizome was introduced by two philosophers around 1970s. No, one philosopher and one psychologist. It was Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. They introduced and they said, the way the world works, actually the best metaphor is the rhizome, which is a type of root. Now, it's a type of root that's quite different from the roots of trees because it spreads horizontally. And it does, after World War II, it does start making a lot of sense to think in terms of the rhizome. And I'll give you an example of what a rhizome is. So I am a rhizome, and I'll give you, so I'm trying to advance my career upwards in Kiel, but it's not going upwards. It's not going anywhere, actually. So, but it is going horizontally. It does spread horizontally. And the fact that I'm here today indicates that because I can travel to other places, right? I can go around the world. I can establish, new colleagues, new friends, etc. And today's corporate labor, they love that. They love telling people, you're not going to get paid a lot better. You're not going to go up the career ladder, but you can spread out horizontally. You can work in different parts of the world. You can connect to new friends. You can establish new cooperation partners. So Rhizome explains really well what has happened in the world after World War II, how it's all about, labor, corporations, universities, etc., how they spread horizontally and they become more global and go to more places. So yeah, so it is true. There is some truth to what Deleuze and Guattari say. And you see that now naturally, given that meta-narratives have lost importance, as well as a tree metaphor, networks became very important in archaeology. I mean, networks have existed since forever. People have been talking about networks since forever, but they gained in popularity quite a lot in the last 20, 30 years. In the work of Ben Jervis, when he talks about assemblage thought in archaeology, it's all very about the relations between things. Then you've got the work of Carl Knappett, network analysis in archaeology, but not just that. Globalization theory, it's all about trade, about people and things moving around, especially the Mediterranean. Tamara Hotto's works, in the Mediterranean Iron Age. So it's all about connections, about people connecting, things moving around, etc. These are just 3 books that the covers are kind of nice, so that's why I put them here. But there's countless. I was going over there through the books that are in that corner, a bunch of books about networks as well. But back in the day, it wasn't like this. In the 19th century, I mean, I know Kant was working way before that. He was already working in the late 1700s. But Kant, Hegel, Marx, all 3 of them, they didn't think in terms of networks. They thought in terms of large-scale narratives. They had narratives that started, the beginning of time, wherever it was for them, and then they go and progress towards something. For Kant, it was what was called the kingdom of ends. For Hegel, it was the absolute. And for Marx, it was communism. So 3 of the biggest thinkers of late 18th century and 19th century, they thought in terms of long-term meta-narrative. You find that eventually in anthropology. In anthropology, late 1800s, you've got Lewis Henry Morgan, who's, establishes, the long-term history of humanity. You've got that, and then this actually lasted way longer than one expected. You've got the work of Morton Freed in the 1960s, social evolutionary theory, and the work of Marshall Sahlins, also, long-term meta-narrative. So it lasted, at least in archaeology and anthropology more specifically, the idea of long-term history was a big thing. But this, in the meanwhile, has been very critiqued. And so, unlike in the work of Byung-Chul Han, you're going to see him quite a lot in the rest of the presentation because I cite him quite a lot. So, in the work of Byung-Chul Han, he points out that unlike modernity with its narrative of the future and progress, it's longing for another form of life. Late modernity does not have a revolutionary pathos of new or fresh beginnings. It lacks the spirit of departure. It is therefore declining into a mode of on and on, as I mentioned before, of absent alternatives. It loses narrative courage, the courage to create a world-changing narrative. Today's tsunami of information sharpens the narrative crisis by throwing us into a maelstrom of actuality. Information cuts up time. Time is reduced to a narrow track of what is momentarily relevant. It lacks temporal extension. The compulsion to actuality destabilizes our life. The past no longer has any effect in the present. The future is narrowed down. It becomes a stream of constant updates on what is currently relevant. We thus exist without a history, for a narrative is a history. So this just got published this year, but we're seeing the same argument. We're seeing the same argument that we found in Fukuyama. We're living in a time without history, a never-ending history. And okay, you might think, okay, all of this is very fancy, but these are a bunch of philosophers and whatever. This is all very abstract. And which is true, but let's talk about our lives today. And I go work, I excavate a bit in Portugal, and there, I'll go to small towns, I'll excavate around them, I have a good time. Things are very slow in small towns. It's their culture, there's a culture of time. There is, in these locations, there's a sense of place. And I use the word place as Marc Auger, the anthropologist, defines it. There's several generations have gone through over here. There's rituals. There are things they're looking forward to. They're like certain festival, certain religious events. There's a link to tradition and the past. It's conservative, not necessarily politically. It's conservative in the sense that they're not really open to a lot of the new fancy stuff that you find in cities, for instance. Slow routines. I get very pissed off when I have to go to a supermarket in one of these villages because the person there is chatting 10 minutes with every customer, and something that should take 5 minutes sometimes takes an hour. So it's people that are, they take their time. Low mobility, people walk around. They don't have to go very far to get whatever they want. It's disconnected from hubs. Sometimes you have to take some strange roads, until you reach these villages. There's a link to territory and land. And, there's local customs and cuisine, which is basically tradition. And identity is based on profession, family, and place. So, when I'm there, when a person visits, they're like, oh, who are you, stranger, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, I'm the son of Ribeiro. Ah, yes, Ribeiro, blah, 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 etc. Right? But most importantly, it's a place where time has significance. It has a rhythm. People understand time here because they give time its own meaning. What's the opposite of this, right? People automatically think, oh, it's the city, right? Not just the city, it's the airport. The airport for me is the paradigmatic place of, no, not paradigmatic place. It's the paradigmatic example of a non-place. According to Marc Auger, he says that airports, it's not a real place. It's not a place in the same sense that a village is. It's transitory. People are passing by. It's marked by fast actions. It's progressive. They're trying to improve things. Very well connected, of course. It's a hub in a network, usually connected to a large city. And identity is based on consumption, lifestyles, and mobility. When I go there and and I, maybe chat with strangers or whatever, and they ask me like what I do, I talk about my job. I don't say I'm the son of Ribeiro to a stranger at an airport. They wouldn't like, what the hell does that mean? Like son of Ribeiro. Like, and it's a place where time has no signification. So sometimes I'm out in, I have to go to the US or whatever. And when I come back, I connect in Heathrow, right? That's the airport and I usually fly overnight. So I take a plane in the evening somewhere in the US, and I arrive in Heathrow in the morning. What do I do when I arrive in the morning, 7, 8 in the morning? I grab a beer. I grab a beer at the time because I've just flown for many hours, a bit thirsty. I need to relax a bit. So I drink a beer. It's 8 in the morning and I'm drinking a beer. But it's not that weird because I've been awake that many hours, right? Like it's like after a long day. But that wouldn't matter in an airport, right? Because time doesn't have the strict schedule for everyone as it does in some place out, like in a village. In a village, you have those routines where people will do the same thing every day. But in an airport, that doesn't make sense to do that because if you're traveling, especially across continents, then time doesn't make sense. Time it's the clock. It's the arrivals and departures. That's what time is. But there's no rhythm to it. There's no actual, time is like, it's like jazz music in an airport. It's like, okay, where is this going? I'm not really sure, And so I'm fascinated by airport. And so this is exactly what Jonathan Crary calls, a 24/7 type time, 24/7 capitalist time. 24/7 announces time without time, time extracted from any material or identifiable demarcation, a time without sequence or recurrence. The primary self-narration of one's life shifts in its fundamental composition. Instead of a formulaic sequence of places and events associated with family, work, and relationships, the main threads of one's life story now is the electronic commodities and media service through which all experience has been filtered, recorded, or constructed. So, really good book. I really enjoyed this book. And also, another fantastic book, Enda Duffy's The Speed Handbook. And so Enda, he makes this really interesting point because, when Jonathan Crary talks about electronic commodities, we don't really realize how much effect this has had on our perception of time. Because in the beginning of the 20th century, what marked speed was the car. But that was overtaken in the second half of the 20th century by the computer. Computer became the paradigmatic example of speed, of what speed is supposed to be. And it's not speed in the sense that it just goes fast. It's also speed in the sense that it does not have to stop. And that's the interesting thing about how we think about labor today. Because once again, we have the network. We have all the electronic commodities connected to a network. The network is open. Let's not forget about the rhizome. The rhizome is an open network. It's open. And the network does not obey a routine. There isn't a night and day for the internet. It exists beyond time. Now, we're now living in a place where, like at the time of my parents, when they worked, my dad, when he stopped working at 5:30, my dad stopped working at 5:30. I never saw my dad work a single minute after his time. It was that old school type where you still had to, use the card. And the moment he, inserted a card and said, like, I left at 5:30 or whatever, that's it. Time was over. And never saw my dad work a single weekend. I mean, he worked quite hard. He was there every day, from around 8 to 5:30. But that has changed. Now, our generation, a lot of our generation, we continue working because we have the laptop. We don't need to be at the office to work. So, and now we're connected to the internet. We can just continue working. And here's the fascinating thing. At the time of our parents, it was the boss that was controlling us. The boss would go to the office and make sure, like, okay, what's that person doing? What's that person doing? Now, you can't do this in a place like this. So who's controlling who? It's the individual. The individual controls themselves. It's a process of self-surveillance where a person submits themselves to this and they control themselves through this. Now, we've got the 24-hour economy. And 24/7 gyms, those exist. There's none in Kiel. I complain a lot about it because sometimes I want to go quite late to the gym. But they exist, especially in big cities. And so this is a convenience store. I think everyone knows what a convenience store. I don't know if any of you have been enough time in Asia, especially in Japan, where these exist. These are called the konbini in Japan, these convenience stores. And so let me tell you a bit. I want to give a bit of time for this because this is more interesting than it seems at face value. So back in Kiel, I work around 40 hours a week, sometimes 50 hours, sometimes weekends, which, ends up making it 60 hours. And on occasion, I have worked something like 70, 80 hours a week. And that's usually, those months before handing in the dissertation or very important deadline, I will work a lot of hours. Then I heard that in Japan, there are people that regularly work 100 hours. And I'm like, that's bullshit. Like, nobody can work 100 hours. Nobody can do that. It's impossible. Well, anyway, some years ago, I got a chance to work a bit in Japan. I got a small grant. I spent some months there. And I was actually working a lot harder there than I was in Kiel. I was like wondering, like, what's going on? Why am I working harder in Kiel? Harder in Japan than in Kiel. And then I started understanding how people can work up to 100 hours. For those who don't know, these convenience stores in Japan, they're literally everywhere. They're like you're always within 4 to 5 minutes from them. And so they're sprinkled everywhere throughout where there's, urbanization. They sell everything. They sell anything you can think of. They're also open 24 hours a day. So when I wanted to work for long hours, I would just go to here. And these were everywhere. So it would take me 1-2 minutes to get to one of them, buy whatever I needed, and then go back to work. I would wake up in the morning. I needed coffee. I'd come here. Breakfast, here. Lunch, here. I needed, toilet paper, here. I needed, like at the end of a very long day, I needed to relax, grab a beer here. If I wanted to work even longer hours, I get a coffee here. And then I realized like, oh, okay, so this is how they do it. When you have an economy that's built around these things, it becomes possible for you to be constantly working because you don't have to plan anything. Anything you need right at that moment, you walk out of the office, of your house, etc., you come here. And you're thinking, well, oh, but Arthur, were you working at the university? These are inside the university as well. They're sprinkled across the university. So you find them in the university as well. So this is a really impressive thing, the Combini, how it's a structure that allows you to just go on and never turn off. You don't need to turn off because everything that you need for your life can be provided by the Combini, among countless other things that Japanese economy provides. So I found this very interesting. And obviously all of this, everything I've said so far creates this idea that you don't need the routine anymore. You can just go on and on and on. And if you want to go to the gym at 3 in the morning, that's fine. It's going to be open. If you need a coffee at 3 in the morning, that's also still open. So, and this is what, going back to Byung-Chul Han in one of his books, there's a general inability to end and to conclude, which is also the cause of today's acceleration. Time is running off because it cannot find an end or conclusion, because it is not restrained by any temporal gravitational force. Acceleration is the expression of the bursting of the temporal dam. There are no longer any dams that regulate, articulate, or give a rhythm to the flow of time. There are no dams to hold or halt time, giving it something to hold on to. Hold in its exquisite double meaning. When time loses all rhythm, when it dissipates into the open without any hold or direction, then all right or good time also disappears. And going back to capitalism, then this type of capitalism, the one, referring to the stuff I mentioned, the 24-hour gym, the 24-hour convenience store. So it's a type of capitalism that lacks narrativity. It does not narrate anything. It merely counts. It deprives time of all meaningfulness. Time is profaned, reduced to labor time. Thus, all days resemble each other. Now, what he means by all days resemble each other, it doesn't mean that, oh, there's this routine that is always the same. It means that they all blur into one another. So, and this is the last section, the last collapse section. Short-termism and immediate gratification, right? We were talking about this earlier today over breakfast. So, Byung-Chul Han, once again, he's everywhere. Western ideals always address concerns of absence. We always think things in terms of, oh, things are missing, right? Absence of money, absence of food, absence of ideas. It's always like we need more. It usually does not contemplate the fact that we are living in a situation of excess. It is always about having more and demanding more at faster rates. The only gratification is immediate gratification. Thus, the popularity of fast food Amazon Prime, and TikTok. But this acceleration allows the attribution of meaning. Things lose significance, especially time. As he says in the Burnout Society, a purely hectic rush produces nothing new. It reproduces and accelerates what is already available, which goes once again into the idea, that capitalism is the same. It's a process of on and on, right? That we're not actually producing something new. We're not moving into something new. Mark Fisher, once again, on the one hand, this is a culture that privileges only the present and the immediate. The extirpation of the long term extends backward as well as forwards in time. For example, media stories monopolize attention for a week or so, then are instantly forgotten. On the other hand, it is a culture that is excessively nostalgic. We also chatted about this during breakfast, given our retrospection, incapable of generating any authentic novelty. And this affects information. This affects the way we think about information. Byung-Chul Han, once again, writes a lot about information. Rationality is also time intensive. Rational decisions require long-term perspective. They're based on reflections that extend beyond the present moment into both past and the future. This temporal expansion characterizes rationality. In the information society, we simply do not have the time for rational action. Discursive rationality is today under threat from effective communication. We allow ourselves to be easily affected by fast sequences of information. It is quicker to appeal to effect than to rationality. In effective communication, it is not the better argument, but the most exciting information that prevails. And you also see this in archaeology. In archaeological theory, people don't talk about rationality anymore. They talk a lot about effect. The work of Yanis Hamilakis, it's all about effect, because that's what's relevant today. Trump, the first Twitter president, fragmented his politics into tweets. His politics is determined not by vision, but by viral information. Infocracy promotes success-oriented, instrumental forms of action and leads to the spread of opportunism. The American mathematician Cathy O'Neill, she's really good, I've read some of her books, observes correctly that Trump acts like a perfectly opportunistic algorithm that takes only the actions of the audience into account. Yep, that's quite relevant today. What's funny is that I made this slide for another talk about 2 years ago, and it's even more relevant even today than it was 2 years ago. So, you're all tired about not hearing about archaeology and stuff? No? Okay, great. Because there's not going to be that much archaeology anyway in this section. We're also talking today about this. So one of the things that has happened is that, and I've noticed this across different publications, across my colleagues, is that they're now very interested in completely disconstruing like periodizations, like history. So for instance, when we talk about the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, people will still, believe that that transition exists, but they'll love pointing out, oh yes, but things that the Neolithic have, we can find them among hunter-gatherers, right? So work of Henny Piazonka, one of my ex-colleagues, she's now in Berlin. Great work. She worked in Russia and in Mongolia. And she did some very interesting work where she identifies, forts, like defensive forts in Russia. And it's among a hunter-gatherer population. And it's a very interesting idea because there's this idea that Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, they don't build like these type of structures. That's something that you only find later with Neolithic. So it's catching on. So people are actively looking for things that show that the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic is not as straightforward. That's something that you find also in David Graeber and David Wengrow's book. In fact, that's one of their central arguments, is that that transition is not as clear. There isn't this strict line where we can say, oh, everything below this time, Paleolithic. Everything above this, that's Neolithic. So, but the thing is, makes sense in the times we are living in, because we're living in a time where, we're breaking down boundaries. We don't like boundaries anymore. And this is something that Gavin Lucas actively promotes in his This is a recent paper and a slightly older paper from 2015, Archaeology and Contemporaneity. He actively critiques like that, periodizations that we make. Oh, that's a very modernist idea that we should abandon them because we're thinking of time incorrectly. We should think them in a network way. We should think about connections between things from today and the past, etc., rather than thinking in distinct periods of time. It's a very good paper, though. It's a very good paper. I don't necessarily agree with it, but he does actively promote this. And this connects to what I was just mentioning. There is an excessive opening up and removal of boundaries, and it's present at all levels of society. It's imperative of neoliberalism. Globalization also dissolves all closed structures in order to accelerate the circulation of capital, commodities, and information. It removes boundary. These sites the world turning it into a global market. A site is a form of closure. The global market is an offsite. Digital networks also abolish sites. The internet is an offsite too. It is not possible to dwell in it. We surf the net. Tourists also travel through the de-sited world. They circulate incessantly like commodities and information. And here again, we have the idea of the non-place and that we're generating more non-places. But it's all about removing boundaries. Not just in time. We're not just removing boundaries in time. We're removing boundaries in terms of geography. There's a lot of books now claiming that the West, the idea of the West doesn't exist, that there's connection throughout history between, what we traditionally conceive the West and Africa and Asia and all of that. There's also a lot written nowadays saying that, cultures, very distinct cultures. No, those don't exist. There's a lot more connection between them. So, fantastic book by Hart and Negri, where they say, so the concept of empire presents itself not as a historical regime originating in conquest, but rather as an order that effectively suspends history and thereby fixes the existing state of affairs for eternity. So, a bit more context, because this is a bit decontextualized. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, in 2000, they wrote a book saying that we're living in a new time. We're not living in a colonial world. We're not living, in this patriarchal, hierarchical type of world. We're living in a global world. And in this global world, what happened is that time has collapsed. And rather than having a distinct past, present, and future, what we have is just one block of time, a present. This in philosophy is called presentism. It's this idea that it's all everything is all connected, and it includes everything, which is why we have these expressions. This book is from 2021, and this is from shortly after, I think 2022 or later that year, later. So that's why our current times have been described in this way. It's in everything all the time, everywhere, or everything everywhere all at once. This is a very interesting idea where it contains it all. We live in this giant block without boundaries. There aren't blocks. It's not like, oh, we're living in, the Middle Ages or we're living in contemporary time. No, it's all one gigantic block. And let's talk a little bit about temporal excess. So I don't know if someone has stumbled upon this paper. There was a paper from, I can't remember, 2008, I think. It was by Chris Anderson. He was, I think, the editor-in-chief of Wired. And he wrote this on a website. This wasn't a scientific paper. He says that end of theory. The data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. Now, bear in mind that he's using the word theory, not as we generally understand, but as hypothesis. He's saying that hypotheses are gone, that you don't use the deductive hypothetical method anymore in a lot of sciences. Because big data, what it does is that it puts everything into an algorithm, puts everything into a computer, it analyzes it and reaches a certain conclusion that you don't have to test hypotheses. And he doesn't necessarily say that this is bad. He doesn't say, oh, this is the wrong way of doing science. But he says that our traditional way of thinking about the scientific method, through the testing of hypotheses, that's gradually disappearing as we engage more with big data. And I find this really fascinating because although we don't, big data, it's usually internet data. That's what the expression was supposed to be used for. It was internet data, and it's billions upon billions of data points. Now, archaeology doesn't deal with that many data points, except perhaps maybe with genetics, et cetera, where they have very large databases. But otherwise, it doesn't really deal with that much information. I mean, nonetheless, it still appears. So Christensen in 2014, he published, towards a new paradigm, the third science revolution, and its possible consequences to archaeology. And he praises it, and he talks about, how cool it is, and he talks about big data, the big databases, et cetera, which are open and people can share and all of that. I, shortly after, not shortly after, it was 5 years later, I said, there are some issues concerning this. The way we think about data, what is science, and what are case studies? I think I have this discussion a lot with colleagues and at conference, et cetera. So what is a case study at this point in time? So what qualifies as a case study? So that's what I tried to address in this paper. And all of this affects our perception of time as well in archaeology. Even the largest accumulation of information, big data, possesses very little knowledge. Big data is used to find correlation. The correlation states when A occurs, B often also occurs. It is not known, however, why this is so. Correlation is the most primitive form of knowledge, being not even capable of ascertaining the relationship between cause and effect. It is so. The question of why becomes irrelevant. Thus, nothing is understood, but knowledge is understanding. Hence, big data renders thought superfluous. We surrender ourselves without concern to it is so. Yeah, so he's been very critical of big data because he thinks it's one of those examples of excess where we just keep adding to it, but we're never capable of interpreting it. We're never capable of interpreting it because there's just too much of it. And in contrast, of course, is his other book about narration, where he thinks narration, that's the best form of knowledge because it's literally adding meaning to time. And then we get to short-termism. I travel to Asia quite often, and like the way they use mobile phones there, it's kind of scary. It's really, really, they're really stuck with cell phones. I remember I was paying attention to someone using a cell phone now recently, and this person was using 5 apps at the same time. It was like the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was like Instagram, TikTok, like some of the, and the speed at which this person was not just scrolling very quickly between one app. This person was scrolling very quickly between 5 apps. So he scroll, switch app, scroll, switch app, scroll. So I was like, this is insane. Like I don't know what's being absorbed. Like what is this person? Now, I find this a bit worrisome because, I don't know if people remember the movie Memento by Christopher Nolan. It's about short-term memory. It's all about the immediate, like seconds in the case of Memento. And we're generating these type of people. This is what has been happening in recent years. And I don't know, I teach a bit out in Kiel. I have noticed that among students. I noticed that they don't have the same attachment that I had back in the day. When I was younger, like 16, 17, sometimes I would read, those fantasy novels. They were like 800 pages. And I could read it like in 2 days because I wasn't being interrupted. I still read nowadays, but I'll check my phone, 50 times while reading. And one of the things that we don't understand is that people of a much younger generation, they never had experienced that phase. They were already born in a period where cell phones already existed, right? So they never had that phase of transition where they go from a non-digital world to a very, very digitalized world. And I can see that effect. I can see that happening in the students, and it's quite worrisome. And I think Mark Fisher, for instance, he was very critical of this because he was a lecturer. And all of this, affects, because everything now, it's short term. Everything is about short term. Funding is short term. Everything is short term. So Jay Cunningham and Scott McGarren, they wrote this really good paper in 2016 called Ethnoarchaeology as Slow Science. And they critique several things here. So Jay Cunningham, as far as I know, he works in Africa. He works, with local populations in Africa. He looks at potters in Africa. And one of the interesting things he tells is that it takes time. It takes time because if you get funding, the first year has to be about getting all the paperwork, all the authorizations, etc. The second year, he goes into the field. But in the second year, he's not automatically meeting, the local populations. He's familiarizing, he's meeting, he's getting new connections, etc. And then the third year, he'll give an example of, and then I do meet, some of the local populations in the third year. But they don't show you all the cool stuff yet. There has to be building of trust, right? He has to come back every year, so he teaches, so he has to come back, when he's time between classes. So he shows up, comes back, brings some gift, and then this takes a while. So when you think about it, it takes about, it takes about 10 years until he can really get really interesting information, get all the publications, etc. But there's no funding for 10 years. Funding is what? There's funding for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. If you're very lucky, maybe 6. But then he says that, well, eventually what happens is that ethnoarchaeology is going to be getting harder and harder and harder to do if you can't deliver results that quickly, right? Because you can't just go into a country and say, oh, bring me, let me go into the forest and meet these people and learn everything about it. No, it takes several years until that can happen. And so, he talks about slow science, the importance of doing slow science and building up ideas, etc. And he's also very critical of big data because he says that big data has replaced a lot of ethnographic research because you can just not even have to go into the field. You can just work with whatever data is already available in databases, data mine that and see what happens. And then he shows some examples of where, they're very problematic studies of that type of research. And as I mentioned, like something like the postdocs of the, Marie Curie, they're 2 years. Between like you arrive somewhere new, you do a bit of research, but then by the second year, you're supposed to be publishing and all of that. But you're worried you're going to be unemployed, right, after the second year. So the second year, you have to worry. So you have to start applying again. So you're in this situation where like, okay, I have to apply for jobs, but I have to finish these papers and send them to, etc. So it's so short term when you think about it. Like you can't do very in-depth research. And of course, all of this then leads, to the big topic that Byung-Chul Han likes to talk about, which is, temporal burnout. It's the burnout because there's no end. We keep going on and on. And as Query also comments, so one of those conditions can be characterized as general inscription of human life into duration without breaks, defined by a principle of continuous function. It is time that no longer passes beyond clock time. Behind the vacuity of the cat trace, 24/7 is a static redundancy that disavows its relation to the rhythmic and periodic textures of human life. A 24/7 environment has a semblance of a social world, but is actually a non-social model of machinic performance and its expression of living that does not disclose the human cost required to sustain its effectiveness. Quite interesting, machinic performance, you find that a lot in the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. It's all about machines. So and this has been, a lot of papers have been coming out in recent years talking about, like the very unsustainable careers that, like postdocs have, PhDs have. I've written also something about it. And more papers are going to come up about this because we are entering into levels of unsustainability when it comes to our work in archaeology. Okay, giving meaning to time. Now, let me just, before I enter the next section, and I'm really almost over, it's just 2 or 3 more slides. I don't like telling, there's a lot of people at conferences, at lectures, they come up to me and they're like, Artur, what's the theory should I follow? What's the cool thing right now? What's the theory? What's the cool theory going on right now? And they're like, oh, Artur, can you come up with a cool theory that we can all work with? And I really dislike that question because I should not be telling all of you how you guys should do your jobs, right? You guys do very good archaeology, I'm sure. And a theorist, a guy that reads, a bunch of books shouldn't show up, hey, you guys should do this. I feel like it's so arrogant to think in that way, to just, when theorists just show up, this is how archaeology should be done. Like, I mean, dude, shut up, man. And so I don't like doing that, but I keep getting asked that every year. And so I'm like, okay, I have to find a middle ground. I have to find, what I like and say, like, this is what I did. This is what I like. And so I'm just going to use an analogy so what should we do? And I'm going to talk about what I like. I'm not going to say this is the best way to do archaeology. One of them is to go small, is to disconnect. We're living in a world of such networks. I think it's really important to start going small again. There has been recently, just this year, special issue on microhistory. There has been some work that was published, Archaeological Dialogues, a great paper about microhistory. I've written about it. I'm a big fan of Carlo Ginzburg. And I find it interesting because it's slow research. If you read Carlo Ginzburg and the research he does, you can tell it's slow. It's something that he takes years and he goes, look, and then I read a book somewhere, and then I, took a walk and then I read, like he has his rhythm, he does, I think he's in his 80s and he's still doing research, he likes to do it calmly and it's great. And that's interesting to do. And I think that's very interesting. I think we need to rethink our meta-narratives as well. That's something that, I get into a lot of fights with social evolutionary theorists. There's still quite a lot of them. They're big fans of it. And they're so dumb. They just say, like, no, you need to accept this. I'm like, no, you need to work on this. Those are 2 different things. Like, there's a lot that you need to rework when we think about social evolution, about periods, about, long-term history. We need to rethink it and do it properly. We can't just say, social evolutionary theory is cool and everyone must accept it. No. We need to sit down, think about it, and really do it properly. Yeah, so in recent years, I've been very adamant in talking about new political critique in archaeology. One that focuses on the effects of neoliberal late capitalism on academics. So I've written about this, I've given several lectures, and I think that political critique, I find it a bit outdated in archaeology. There's a lot of people complaining about, I don't know, let's say hierarchies. And I'm like, but why is no one critiquing networks and how our society is so much structured around networks, for instance? So I think this is something also important. And also critique the technologies of power and their effects on our labor and our mental condition. This is connected, both of these. And that's also something I find very important. And I was traveling recently on the flight back. I watched Perfect Days by Wim Wenders. Fantastic movie. I absolutely loved it. And I think it really, encapsulated the idea of going small, of looking into a small thing. Now, I don't think it's just, I don't want to oversimplify this. I think there's a lot of work. I need to look very carefully into this about going small, going slow, and all of this, because I think it's very dangerous to just say, oh yeah, just look at small local routines of people. I think that's, not the best way. And, when it comes to meta-narratives, there's very interesting work. The work of Koji and Karatani in Japan, The Structure of World History, very fascinating book from 2014. The Interior World of Capital, talks about how the world became a globe, how it became spherical. It's a very interesting also meta-narratives. He has an introduction where he says, I know people don't like meta-narratives, but this is what I'm going to present, and it's pretty cool. And I really enjoyed this book as well. So these are just two books, just two thinkers out of countless, I think, that can contribute to our way of thinking about archaeology and meta-narratives long-term history. And these are some of the publications I've worked on concerning all these topics. And that's pretty much it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can you please maybe turn on the light? Not, I can try to do it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Please, do we have any questions? Yes, please. Yeah, it won't be easy, I guess, because they gave us 1 hour more or less and they stopped. So we need to talk louder, I'm afraid, because they are back to work.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I really like the lecture very much.
Thank you.
I have a about, I wrote it down, sorry.